If you've been debating frequently at lefty-dominated places, or you're even interested in philosophy, you might recognize that it is quite often that people appeal to utilitarianism in order to justify their political or social stances. Especially this phenomenon is common among people who call themselves consequentialists, meaning that they judge an action based on its consequences, and particularly they assume that the best action one should ever take is the one that will maximize utility, which ultimately dumps down to a subjective psychological satisfaction of a person or a group of people that will come about due to a given action. This sort of thinking is particularly popular amongst the Marxist types, who even justify their own hypocrisy appealing to consequentialism and utilitarianism. For example, they might say, sure, I might exploit like 10 people working for me and not allow them to unionize or even own the means of production, but if we look at the bigger picture, those actions have little consequences, and at the end of the day I'm for worker co-ops. Moreover, have you heard of the economies of scale? It's not like I'm Jeff Bezos or something. But this video is not going to be about Marxists and other leftists who are infected with this sort of thinking. Rather, it will be the refutation of the utilitarian philosophy with the best of my abilities. A refutation that will contain 7+1 objections towards it. And before I shall name my series of objections towards this philosophy, it is important for one to understand what this philosophy truly means, and as you can guess, just like an ideology that is subjective, it has many versions of it, ranging from rule and act utilitarianism to total, sentient and negative utilitarianism, which all may differ in some little details, but ultimately they all accept one core assumption that I'm going to critique in this video. In particular, the assumption that one should maximize utility, which by itself is a subjective psychological satisfaction, and of course minimize disutility, which is a subjective psychological dissatisfaction. And sure, you may say happiness, well-being instead of what I said, but if you read Mill, Bentham, Popper and other utilitarian advocates, it really dumps down to what I said. And on the surface level, that sounds pretty smart, and not just smart, but almost scientific, as when one is doing a calculus, according to Jeremy Bentham, one should determine the intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and of course subsequently an individual or a collective must act in a way that will maximize the extent of pleasure over pain, as that's what this philosophy is about, especially the hedonistic utilitarianism. And if our world had zero negative consequences from pleasure and was made out of rainbows and we were all gay unicorns operating under Jean-Jacques Rousseau's general will, then maybe it would have been the most dominant philosophy on the land. However, as we live on planet Earth, as another creatures shaped by the forces of evolution and reason, a natural series of objections arises to such a philosophy. My first objection is actually not mine, but in fact belongs to John Rawls, who apart from that had also other great things to say, such as defending negative eugenics, as it was consistent with his original position. But unfortunately he won't be remembered for that, but that's a story for another day. In our case, John Rawls made an argument that the greatest good for the greatest number on the massive scale will result in inequalities. In other words, there are inequalities in terms of psychological satisfaction or even other measures of utility. People with low quantity of utility will not be satisfied, and in a sense that is similar to capitalism. But you might say, hey, I reject the notion that utility should be maximized in absolute numbers for the collective. I believe that everyone should have around the same amount of utility. I'm for the average distribution of utility. Well, that's also impossible, my friend, as no person would have the same psychological responses to a given phenomenon, as the utilitarian calculus is subjective. Even if we lived under communistic utopia, equal outcomes are not possible. If one was to be logically consistent, then one should set free the outliers in order to achieve a preferred result. While if you still wish to maximize total utility and not the average utility, no matter the inequalities, then you might as well produce a shit ton of babies and neurostimulating substances in order to keep them satisfied. My second objection naturally comes from that level of subjectivity, or should I even say relativity, as some people get enjoyment from things others do not, which is to say that an implementation of utilitarianism on the massive scale will simply not work. People's interests often go against each other, and not just in the workplace. In case if Marxists are watching me, the interests of other groups are also in conflict, as for example, it is in the psychological satisfaction of the police to be left alone and not being attacked, while it is in the psychological interests of the Antifa types or other criminals to get rid of them, no matter what the public opinion or even police thinks of it. People I've read before often bring up sadism and masochism, but I think one can dig deeper than that and say that it doesn't just revolve around individual or sexual matters, and one way we can make this deeper is to bring up Karl Popper's negative utilitarianism, which argues that we should minimize psychological disutility. But as we live in a multicultural and pluralistic society, we cannot agree on what to do with certain groups like BLM. My third objection to utilitarianism is that it's not even clear who it applies to, and as a result it is kind of absurd. There are literal utilitarianism who wish to apply this principle to criminals, to animals, and even to creatures so simple as ants, so that we take their psychological opinion into the consideration while making a choice, and we better not bring this utility to pigs or chickens or other living creatures for our own benefit, as according to Jeremy Bentham's dogma, the interests of all should be treated equally, and in a situation where the line of who we consider a member is blurred, it leads to absurdities, such as when we widely overestimate our duties to animals. My fourth objection to utilitarianism is its lack of intrinsic morality, as they judge an act based off of its psychological utility, so therefore, from the utilitarian perspective, things like keeping promises, if the person you're keeping a promise to is dead, or is not of your own self-interests, if you're an egoistical utilitarian, of course it should not be required, as there is just no value attached to it. What do you get out of it? You can cheat on your husband or wife as long as you don't tell them that, because if you tell them, only then it will bring you and them this utility. Moreover, why just stop at that? You can sure do other sort of stuff we might recognize as immoral, such as cannibalism or blink blink, a similar political structure to that of Israel. Whether you consider it moral or immoral, I certainly don't attach morality to it, but I was really surprised that they are justified by the utilitarian philosophy. If people want to live in an ethno-state and it will bring them psychological benefits such as a stronger trust and more equality, let them have it, the logic goes. The more you know, huh? Unfortunately, for some strange reason, I have not seen Vosh and Destiny justifying that. Well, maybe because they are some sort of a cringy conservative moral fags who are not rational enough to accept their favorite philosophy to the fullest extent. Perhaps one should introduce them into moral relativism 101 and they might learn a thing or two. My fifth objection to utilitarianism is a Jordan Peterson styled one, and basically as a result of utilitarianism's reliance on moral consequentialism, you are expected to do a lot of shit in order to bring the supposed maximum amount of good to the society. For instance, you will never go beyond your limit and you will be constantly obliged to fulfill the maximum of your abilities, which can vary from sacrificing oneself for the greater good or donating most or all of your money to charity. In the real world, acts like that are considered morally worthy and considered as if you went beyond your limit and accomplished something intrinsically morally righteous and even heroic, while under utilitarianism, you basically must do this stuff constantly and you will never reach the ceiling because you can always do better and will never be perfect, but you will constantly feel obliged to satisfy the demand, just as those far-left white liberals who feel a strong sense of duty to suck up to every other group besides them and validate them, and perhaps they are the truest utilitarians as they are also the most universalist and as a result mentally unstable, which is just another separate point to reject utilitarianism. And since I brought up moral consequentialism and not caring for the means, it is ultimately unjust as a result, as it fails to be intrinsically moral, and it being a consequentialist ideology, transforms into a state where whatever means that will bring the greatest average amount of utility or the highest total amount of utility can be justified. And whether it is the collectivization of the Soviet Union, stealing stuff if you really need it, or not punishing a murderous scientist who may help to produce a better vaccine for COVID-19. As long as the end result will bring utility to the people, means like that should suffice. But you might object and say, hey, wait a minute, you have rule utilitarianism, which argues that a specific action is morally justified if it conforms to a justified moral rule. And you may have a point, but it's not really that utilitarian, as it is in conflict with act utilitarianism, and it is more in line with Kant's categorical imperative, which is counter-utilitarian. So if you really believe in that, you might as well just reject utilitarianism as a whole, as a utilitarian cannot be telling the truth if lying maximizes utility. Finally, there is the issue with the predictive power of consequentialism, as it varies depending on the action. The predictive power of an end utility that may range from negative, that is this utility, to a maximum utility, that is 1. For instance, the utilitarian consequences of raising the minimum wage in the US to $15 an hour are hard to quantify and in some cases would even bring this utility. Even though I am sympathetic to such a proposal, it is hard to predict exactly what will happen as a result. My seventh objection to utilitarianism precisely deals with the matter of utility and psychological satisfaction, and they both are at conflict with each other to the surprise of the early utilitarians. The thing about it is that abusing drugs, porn, alcohol, or any other type of activity or a substance that may give you short-term pleasure will ultimately give you long-term consequences that are not going to be of a great utility if we define utility as one's fitness, which is not just physical, but rather all-encompassing concept. Substance addiction and a destruction of one's dopamine responses or any other change of character are proven to be evolutionary not beneficial and of a bad fitness. Consider the experience machine that virtual reality, video games and certain narcotics are trying to implement. Do you think it is a great idea for all of us to live in an episode of the Black Mirror, where we live just for the hedonistic pleasure and with no real concern for our fitness, which often comes at the expense of pleasure? And that's my ultimate point. Utilitarianism ultimately fails at the most important part of the equation, and that is precisely the self. The overexposure of oneself to pleasure will inevitably lead to erosion of good character and an increase of environmental mutational load into the population if this philosophy was to be followed by many people, and therefore it would implement a failure of both at the individual and the collective level. Unfortunately, living in the contemporary West, where people value strong individualism and whatever bring one a sense of pleasure, and the do-you approach to life, which quite ironically is at conflict with utilitarianism on the collective scale, I have to make arguments against such a philosophy that is contradictory and fails at its core. First, at the assumption that one should value subjective psychological satisfaction, and as a result quite often be blind to factors that may be psychologically unsatisfying to learn about. And second, it fails at the consequentialist part, as it has little predictive power and many variations of predictions and subjective understandings of what really will bring the most amount of utility often puts everything at conflict. Perhaps if this philosophy did not produce so much bewilderment and was just hedonistic, I would have a hard time arguing against it, but considering that hedonism is not really beneficial both in the long run and in the evolutionary sense, I would still make the case against it, and even more, challenge its dogmas that the most important value we should strive for is subjective psychological utility and that we all have it equally. And if the common understanding of utility maximizes something in our contemporary society, it sure maximizes mutational load. And on that based note, I end this video encouraging you to share it with other people so that they know why utilitarianism is cringe.